Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on Mexico Set by Len Deighton. This is the second installment in Deighton's absolutely incredible Game, Set, Match trilogy. And these were published in the 1980s, and if you've never read them, but you're a fan of spy fiction, of thrillers, of action or adventure novels, I cannot recommend these books highly enough. Deighton accomplished something very special with this trilogy. In the real world, the Cold War was nearing its end, but that is not evident on these pages. There's something very balanced, very dangerous about the encounters in these books, particularly in Mexico Set. The Cold War does not seem to have moved into an endgame in this trilogy, even as it was in the real world. And there's something else Deighton's doing, both with Berlin Game, here in Mexico Set, and ultimately in London Match, where he seems to go back and look at the past 20 years of spy fiction, his own and that written by others, and he starts to revise some themes. He reflects on ideas, he takes themes, he takes plot points and betrayals, and he works them together into this new concoction that emerges as just an incredible novel. As I said, if you've never heard these, dig in. I'm going to be spoiling Berlin Game quite a bit in this discussion, but I'll try to avoid spoiling Mexico Set too much, but dive into it. So we pick up in the aftermath of Berlin Game, where Bernard Sampson, a longtime British intelligence agent, has found out that there was a mole in the Secret Service, and it was his wife. She has fled, and he's sort of picking up the pieces of his personal life and his professional life. Everyone suspects him. There's a danger now to every encounter that he has. He's looking around his shoulder. He's worried about his children. He's worried about, now that his wife is gone and he doesn't have access to the funds from her family trust, how does he afford the house that he is, sharing with his family, with his children? And how does he prove his loyalty to a service that suspects him at every page? And that is what just makes this such a special book. Is we see ideas from John le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, where there's a character who is sort of disgraced, working his way back into favor inside and outside of the system, having to sort of bend rules in order to find his path forward. We see that here. There's that personal touch that happens. And the fact that these books are written in the first person from Bernard's point of view really emphasize and reinforce that personal nature of betrayal that he's felt. Another component that has been revised is the idea of bringing someone over, of convincing someone to come back, and switch teams during the Cold War, find the double agent. And that's something that Deighton himself had worked with in Berlin Game, for example, with, the way that book starts is bringing an agent over from East Germany. But it was also something that certainly had been worked over in le Carré's The Spy Who Came Out In From the Cold, and especially in Smiley's People. And I think those are books that Deighton is drawing on to really frame what he's working with here. But there's a level of danger and action that emerges in this book. So I'm going to read a passage. It's from the beginning, so it's not really a spoiler. It was 2:35 when I was awakened by the car. I saw the lights of it flashing over the ceiling long before I heard its engine. At first I thought it was just a disturbed dream, but then the bright patch of light flashed across the ceiling again, and I heard the diesel engine. It never struck me that it might be Paul Biederman or any of the family coming home. I knew instinctively that there was danger. I slid open the glass door and went outside onto the balcony. The weather had become stormy. Thin, ragged clouds raced across the moon, and the wind had risen so that its roar was confused with the sound of the breakers on the rocks below. I watched the car. The headlights were high and close together, a configuration that suggested some Jeep-like vehicle, as did the way it negotiated the bad road. It was still going at speed as it swung round the back to the garage area. The driver had been here before. There were two voices. One of the men had a key to the front door. I went through the guest bedroom and crouched on the interior gallery so that I could hear them speaking in the lounge below. He's run away, said one voice. Perhaps, said the other, as if he didn't care. They were speaking in German. There was no mistaking the Berlin accent of Eric Stein's, but the other man's German had a strong Russian accent. His car is not here, said the first man. What if the Englishmen arrived before us and took off with them? We would have passed them on the road, said Steins. He was perfectly calm. I heard the sound of him putting his weight onto the big sofa. That's better. A sigh. Take a drink if you want it. It's in the cabinet in his study. That stinking jungle road. I could do with a bath. You call that jungle? Said Steins mildly. Wait till you go over to the East Coast. Wait until you go across to the camp where the freedom fighters are trained and cut your way through some real tropical rainforest with a machete and spend half the night digging chiggers out of your backside. You'll find out what a jungle is like. "What we came through will do for me," said the first man. I raised my head over the edge of the gallery until I could see them. They were standing in the moonlight by the tall window. They were wearing dark suits and white shirts and trying to look like Mexican businessmen. Steins was about 40 years old, my age. He'd shaved off the little Lenin-style beard he'd had when I last saw him, but there was no mistaking his accent or the hard eyes glittering behind the circular, gold-rimmed spectacles. This encounter is one of many where there is danger. There seems to be this mortal danger for Bernard and for those around him. There's a higher body count in this book than Burlingame, which in many ways, as excellent as it is, Mexico surpasses Burlingame on almost every level. And there's just a real tension in this novel that emerges and that develops and builds. We also get the cynical side of Bernard, despite the fact that he's absolutely terrified and working his way towards being back into good grace with his Secret Service. He still has the cynical, sardonic side, and this is an encounter with his father-in-law. "Come in and sit down, Bernard, old chap." He was working on a painting when I got there, but he was not at the easel. He was seated at a small table, a drawing board resting on his knees while he penciled in the outlines of a landscape with horses. On the table, there were half a dozen enlarged photos of the same view, photos of horses and a sheet of tracing paper from which he'd worked. "You've discovered my little secret," he said, without looking up from his sketch. "I always start off from photographs. No sense in not using all the help you can get. Michelangelo would have used a camera when doing the Sistine Chapel ceiling had he got the chance." Since David Kimber Hutchinson showed no sign of revealing more about Michelangelo's frustrated technological aspirations, I grunted and sat down while he finished drawing the horse. Although it was a faithful reproduction of the horse in the photo, David's trace drawing of it looked wooden and stunted. He was obviously aware of this, for he was redrawing the outline to extend its legs, but that didn't seem to improve it. He was wearing a dark blue artist's smock over his yellow cashmere roll neck and riding breeches. His face was flushed. I guess he'd just got back from a canter over the downs. It was rather as if he'd arranged things so that I would see him tracing his pictures. Perhaps he thought I would admire such acquired trickery more than mere talent. A man could not take credit for talent in the way he could for cunning. Eventually, he abandoned his attempt and put the pencil down on the table in front of him. "I can never draw horses," he said. "It's just not fair. No artist loved horses as I do, or knew as much about them, but even when I use photos, I can't damn well draw them. It's not fair." I'd never heard him appeal to equity before. Usually he upheld the ultimate justice of market forces, and even the survival of the fittest. "Perhaps it's because you trace photos," I said. "Maybe you should trace paintings." And so that we still have that side of Bernard, that sardonic side, this irony and humor, this sense that he's, in a sense, always been an outsider. That he, as someone who grew up in Germany, his father had been an intelligence agent, he never quite fit in fully into any world. And now he's out of every world. He's out of step everywhere. And that comes through, that paranoia, that tension really builds into just a fantastic book. We travel through Europe. There's a whole portion of the book that is, in fact, set in Mexico. It reflects some of what was going on with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and various conflicts that were happening in Central America in the 1980s and before. But Deighton is really interested in getting into Bernard's mind, into the fear, the sweat of this character. And I think it works. I think it's a fantastic book. So I'd highly recommend you read it. As mentioned, it's part of the great trilogy with Burlingame that ends with London Match. I had mentioned as well, I think there's a deep influence of Deighton sort of returning back to Funeral in Berlin, which he'd written some 20 years before in the middle 1960s. And even shades of the Ipcress file, though I think there's much more of Funeral Berlin, both in Burlingame and in Mexico set. As I mentioned as well, I think he's taking McCarry's famous Carla trilogy, specifically the Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and Smiley's People, and really revising those, putting them together, taking them apart and putting them together in some really interesting ways. Another Cold War novelist from the U.S. would be Charles McCarry. And I think The Last Supper is probably the work that feels closest to what Deighton was doing with the Game Set Match trilogy. This is a book that really explores generational sort of life within the CIA. But if you're interested in McCarry, you might also really enjoy The Tears of Autumn, which is just an incredible book. It's a spy novel that deals with the Kennedy assassination, written far before one would perhaps have expected. So this was Mexico Set. Hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.